All right, great day, Gadfly subscribers. Hey, it's Carlos. Today is Saturday, June the 27th, and it's 10 a.m. And we are waiting for the Schiller Institute to begin their first panel one of the Will Humanity Prosper or Perish? The future demands a four-power summit now, and this is kind of in follow-up to the discussion that Paul and I had back on June 23rd in regards to Putin's olive branch United States. This is the article that he put forth in regards to the 75th anniversary of World War II, where he later talked about a little about the future and the urgent need for the world communities to come together to work out some of these issues that are taking place in real time. And so the Schiller Institute has been very instrumental in working to advocate for this meeting to take place. Want to thank the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp LaRouche, also our friend Harley Schlanger, who is also very instrumental with the LaRouche Pack and to forge this conversation ahead. Ironically enough, just after that article came out, you may have read that there was a U.S. intelligence alleged that Russia was willing to pay mercenaries to go after U.S. military personnel. We have to really look at that with a grain of salt in regards to the timing of that coming out. I don't want to say it was hilarious because obviously it should be taken seriously, but I think as Putin put that out, saying, "Hey, it's time for the leaders to come together, talk about the realignment of the changes that's taken place," just so important during this time. So bear with me for one moment. And again, we are simulcasting this from the Schiller Institute and want to thank them for putting this together. You can go to the schillerinstitute.com and you will find the information there in regards to the full agenda, the full conference. We'll probably simulcast at least the first portion of it. But if you do want to watch the entire conference, you can go to the schillerinstitute.com and it will have all the information there for you to watch the second part as well. There's going to be three panels. Panel 2 is why 1.5 billion productive jobs program can end the war. And then the panel 3 is the job of youth. So, again, these are some, geopolitical think tanks, and glad that we could be bringing the simulcast together. And we're just patiently waiting for them to start. So I'm going to go radio silent for just a moment. And thank you all for tuning in.
Oh, hello, everyone. I'm sorry there was a pretty big technical problem, but we'll be back online here in just a minute. Okay. Okay, good. Hi, Boris. I'm sorry about that. There's a problem. Have you ever had internet crash? Okay, I think we're good. Can you turn the light up on its face? It looks different again, doesn't it? Doesn't it look different?
No,
It looks dark. Turn it up on its face, please. Who? Yeah, shit. They're not connected. Oh, fuck. Okay, it's gonna take me, I need a minute here. I need a minute.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Dennis Speed, and I want to welcome you to today's international conference and webcast. We had a technical problem for a moment, and now we think we've solved that problem. Today's conference is called Will Humanity Prosper or Perish? The Future Demands of Four-Power Summit Now. We're going to begin today with a statement that was recorded in 2011 by the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. And he was keynoting a panel of the Schiller Institute. This was in Germany. And the name of the particular panel and that occasion was Rescuing Civilization from the Brink, the Role of Classical Culture, an Imperative for Mankind.
This is truly the most important of all strategic questions we have to face today. The fact that the human species, which is absolutely unique in its capabilities, there's no other known species in the universe ever known to have existed or could exist, even though we have not fully explored, of course, the Crab Nebula or similar parts of the great galaxy which we're involved in called the Milky Way. There may be many species with cognitive powers out there because the solar system of which we are immediately a product, so always under the control of the galactic processes. And we know a good deal today about those kinds of things. Our organization in the United States has spent a good deal of effort on concentrating inclusively on just this question: how old is life? How long has life existed in this, who's been on this planet only for a few million years? There was no human being on this planet, to the best of our knowledge, until a few million years ago. And yet, we're talking about billions of years of this galaxy, during which all living processes known to us have come into existence. And all life is creative, but there's a sad part, that over 95% of all known living species have been rendered extinct as failures in their time. The question, therefore, why in these times, when we've entered a period in which there will be more great kills of living processes at this phase of the movement of the solar system through the galaxy, why should we be so presumptuous as to imagine that human life is not about to disappear as the dinosaurs did in the last great kill? What is there about human beings that says they're not just another animal species ready to get to the chop in the course of their time? The answer is a very little known question. Most people don't have an inkling of what the answer is. As a matter of fact, our societies are run on the basis of people who have no inkling what the human species is. All they can come up with is an explanation of some kind of an animal with animal characteristics, of pleasure and pain and things like that might control the behavior of this animal. So why should we expect that we have a right to claim that the human species is going to survive the approaching point of a great kill in the course of the movements of the solar system up and below and around the galaxy we inhabit? How do we know that this 62 million year cycle is not going to take the human species away, as it's taken so many away before, and then before that, and then before that? And here you all these people talking about politics. They're talking about issues of politics. They're talking about practical opinion and public opinion and differentiations and costumes and all those kinds of things. And here we are, we're approaching the time of the great kill, where everything about us may suddenly disappear. So what are we worried about? If we're going to disappear, why do we worry? Why do we fight it? What is there in us that is not in other living species known to us, that might somehow miraculously pronounce a destiny for our human species, which we grant to no other living species? The name for that specific quality, which we know in the human species, which does not exist in any other known living species, is a quality of creativity which is absolutely unique to mankind. And if you're not creative, and if you don't understand creativity, you haven't got a ticket to survival yet. Because creativity won't save you unless you use it.
We are continuing to experience highly unusual technical difficulties. Those of you in the English-speaking section of the planet just heard that clip and heard it very clearly, and I understand you eventually got a video of that. But there were some problems on some of our international connections. What we're going to do is we're going to play this again because it's an essential part of our message for today. Let me simply say before we do that, that we appreciate that people are bearing with us. This is a highly unusual situation, as generally as is for everybody on the planet for other reasons. So we want to make sure that the rest of the audience that we've assembled today, which is a worldwide audience, is up with everybody else. And so what we're going to do is we're going to replay what you've just seen. That is the entirety of the introduction. And I don't think it will bear a problem for you to hear it again. Thank you.
This is truly the most important of all strategic questions we have to face today. The fact that the human species, which is absolutely unique in its capabilities, there's no other known species in the universe ever known to have existed or could exist, even though we have not fully explored, of course, the Crab Nebula or similar parts of the great galaxy which we're involved in, called the Milky Way. There may be many species with cognitive powers out there, because the solar system, of which we are immediately a product, so always under the control of the galactic processes. And we know a good deal today about those kinds of things. Our organization in the United States has spent a good deal of effort on concentrating inclusively on just this question: how old is life? How long has life existed in this galaxy, or within it, some place in it? What is the nature of mankind, who's been on this planet only for a few million years? There was no human being on this planet, to the best of our knowledge, until a few million years ago. And yet, we're talking about billions of years of this galaxy, during which all living processes known to us have come into existence. And all life is creative, but there's a sad part, that over 95% of all known living species have been rendered extinct as failures in their time. The question, therefore, why in these times, when we've entered a period in which there will be more great kills of living processes at this phase of the movement of the solar system through the galaxy, why should we be so presumptuous as to imagine that human life is not about to disappear as the dinosaurs did in the last great kill? What is there about human beings that says they're not just another animal species ready to get to the chop in the course of their time? The answer is a very little known question. Most people don't have an inkling of what the answer is. As a matter of fact, our societies are run on the basis of people who have no inkling what the human species is. All they can come up with is an explanation of some kind of an animal with animal characteristics, of pleasure and pain and things like that, that might control the behavior of this animal. So why should we expect that we have a right to claim that the human species is going to survive the approaching point of a great kill in the course of the movements of the solar system up and below and around the galaxy we inhabit? How do we know that this 62 million year cycle is not going to take the human species away, as it's taken so many away before, and then before that, and then before that? And here you all these people talking about politics. They're talking about issues of politics. They're talking about practical opinion and public opinion and differentiations and costumes and all those kinds of things. And here we are, we're approaching the time of the great kill where everything about us may suddenly disappear. So what are we worried about? If we're going to disappear, why do we worry? Why do we fight it? What is there in us that is not in other living species known to us, that might somehow miraculously pronounce a destiny for our human species, which we grant to no other living species? The name for that specific quality which we know in the human species, which does not exist in any other known living species, is a quality of creativity which is absolutely unique to mankind.
We are continuing to have a problem for our international audience, and I had to make an announcement here. I understand that everybody that is on from other countries is in the Zoom meeting. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to end that and reconnect it. However, we have to first state that the Spanish, then the German, and then the French, I guess in that sequence. We have to have interpretation so people actually know what we're doing. And then we will resume at the point that we have reconnected that international sector. All right, so I don't know that I can be seen or not, but certainly I understand my voice can be heard. So I want to give people an idea what is happening, what we're going to be doing. Soon as we have this technical problem under some sort of control, we're going to go directly to the keynote speech of Helga Sepp-LaRouche. We're about 15 minutes behind schedule, but we'll be able to do certain things to make that up. I want to apologize again so that people just have an idea. This is a highly unusual circumstance. We're not going to talk a lot about that right now. Let me simply say, so that the idea is known about what the format is, we are going to have our keynote speech, followed by representatives from China and from Russia and several others. The topic of the panel, as we announced before, is instead of politics, the principles of statecraft. Let me say about the Schiller Institute and what we've been doing with this conference, or this process of conferences, because it actually began back in April of this year. April 25th and 26th, we held the first of what is now the 3 conferences. And these conferences were devoted to the idea of the creation of a 4-power summit: Russia, China, India, and the United States. There are various processes that have been able to move in that direction already. And we are in a process, and today, in fact, among many of the things we'll be talking about today is what a new proposal that has been put forward by President Vladimir Putin of Russia to that effect. Let me also say that for people in the United States in particular, the crisis that has been on people's mind, as exhibited in the social and political crises in the streets of America, is merely one predicate of a broader international process. And that's why we're starting today with this first panel, to give that broader overview and to allow you and others to become part of an international operation to reverse that circumstance. Now, as I said, I think the primary problem that we are dealing with is that we are trying to make sure that the international contacts are also connected. And we have translators, and we have a need to make sure that everything is moving in sync. That's one of the particular problems of this kind of international operation. Let me say one other thing concerning this, the excerpt that you saw from Lyndon LaRouche, which was done in 2011. LaRouche's conception there concerning the idea that that was strategy, that this the idea of thinking about strategy from the standpoint of a galactic process, and then looking then and only then at the various political episodes that were occurring on Earth, was a way of trying to actually look at what he also referred to often as intelligence. He was the founder in 1974 of the Executive Intelligence Review. And that publication, which is still published to this day, specialized in trying to make his method of intelligence and of investigation available generally in American analysis. This was very successful, in particular in the drive for certain policy changes that occurred in the United States, most notably that of March 23rd, 1983, with the creation of the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was the product of a process of negotiation that LaRouche carried out as a back-channel negotiator with the then Soviet Union, and at the knowledge of the National Security Council and the President of the United States, then President Ronald Reagan. And that policy and the creation of that policy and that dialogue with the then Soviet Union is in one sense not a model for now, but is the same sort of process that must needs be allowed to continue and to happen between President Donald Trump, President Vladimir Putin, President Xi Jinping, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, among others. The idea of the 4-power conception or 4-power summit is not exclusionary, doesn't say that other powers are not involved. And in fact, recent proposals have amplified or expanded the number of persons that might in fact be involved. But what is important to understand is that, as LaRouche had once said in another document published in 1978 called A Dialogue with Leonid Brezhnev, then the head of the then Soviet Union, the content of a policy is the method by which it's made. So in the clip that you've seen there, the idea of culture and the idea of what a culture actually is a strategic matter. In the case of the United States, and in the case of the present day United States, these matters of a cultural paradigm and cultural paradigm shift are actually often far more important than the particular political issues that people talk about. For example, if you look at today's United States, the issue of our having gone away from being a productive culture, in fact, the most productive economy in world's history, between the period in particular of the 1933 resurgence of America that occurred under Franklin Roosevelt through the period of 1945, and then the subsequent period of 1944 through 1971 with the Bretton Woods system. It's been the need to return to that and to return to these ideas, those that had come into the currency under Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. That is the template for what we are saying should be the character of discussion between President Trump, President Putin, President Xi, and Prime Minister Modi. I want to make one thing clear to everyone as we are about to transition, I understand, to go back, in fact, get to the keynote, that in thinking about what we are all involved in today, namely that global pandemic condition created by the coronavirus, clearly what has happened is that there's a need for all of us to change our axioms, that the idea of international cooperation among nation states, among sovereign independent nation states, for the purpose of creating a worldwide alternative to what's otherwise going to be perhaps the destruction of civilization. Not because absolutely everybody would die of the coronavirus or something like that, but the cascading effects and the interconnected effects of a global pandemic condition that we don't really medically understand, plus the ongoing problem of the financial virus that has, of course, plagued humanity, particularly since the time of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. This combination would create a circumstance in which only all nations working together can possibly achieve an actual reconciliation of this process. Okay, I think we're actually about ready to begin. And what I'm going to do here is say a couple words just about the keynote speaker. Helga Sepp-LaRouche was the founder of the Schiller Institute. That was back in 1984. She is also, of course, was the wife of the economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, who passed away in February of 2019. She played a crucial role, decisive role in a set of conversations and dialogues with the government of China during the period of 1993 to 96, launching what became called the not merely the process that launched. I don't mean that that launched the Silk Road, and we're happy and proud to present her to you now to begin the dialogue. Again, the panel as a whole is, instead of geopolitics, a new form of statecraft. So it's always my honor to introduce Helga Sepp-LaRouche.
But after this difficult beginning, I'm all the more happy that I finally am connected to you. And, I'm going to talk about the alternative to a dark age or the danger of a new world war. And even if it's unconceivable for most people at this point, if we don't succeed in the very short term to replace the hopelessly bankrupt financial system by a new Bretton Woods system, exactly as it originally was intended by Franklin D. Roosevelt, namely to create an instrument to forcefully overcome the underdevelopment of the so-called developing sector, then the current orientation.
Well, things continue to be eventful. We were having an audio problem, according to some of our colleagues. And so what we're just trying to do is correct that. And here I am again. So I only want to say that this is not happened before. And you can draw your own conclusions about that. I will point out one other element, which is that we want to make sure that you all help us in this situation, make sure that anybody that may have gotten off because of the problems would be recontacted by you and told to get back on. I understand we've now fixed the problem, so we're going to resume.
So I don't know if you heard what I said before, because obviously there were some technical problems, but I was saying that even if most people cannot imagine that that can occur, that unless we in the very short term implement a new Bretton Woods system exactly as Franklin D. Roosevelt had intended it, that the current orientation of the world towards ever more conflicts, both domestically in many states of the world, but also on a strategic level, threatens to escalate into a great new war, a third world war, which, because of the existence of thermonuclear weapons, would mean the annihilation of the human species. The great kill, even if it is meant in a slightly different way than Lynn just was heard on this video clip. Also, it is really absolutely astounding how many misguided people still believe that the COVID-19 pandemic is either no worse than the flu or just a conspiracy by Bill Gates. The much more likely perspective is unfortunately what the epidemiologist Dr. Osterholm has said, namely that we still have an incredibly long journey ahead of us. Until now, 10 million people have been affected, 500,000 of people have died, and we have not even reached the peak of the first wave. The almost non-existing health systems of the developing countries are already hopelessly overstretched. The pandemic has ruthlessly exposed the fact that the neoliberal economic system not only depends on cheap labor production in the so-called third world, but has even created in the United States and in Europe a slave labor condition, as can be seen by the outbreak in the many slaughterhouses in Europe and the United States. The economic shutdown has thrown light on the fragility of what is called globalization. In the United States, 40 million jobs were lost in 3 months. The central banks pumped an unbelievable more than $20 trillion into the financial system. And the various government support systems could barely cover up the time bombs that are still ticking with the expiring of the short work programs. The IMF currently expects that global production will decline by 4.9% this year. And China is the only country which is expected to have an increase in production of 2%, which obviously is much less than it used to be, but nevertheless it grows. Sectors such as air traffic, catering, tourism, the car industry have suffered massive declines, some of them long-term, but also a large number of medium-sized companies fear that they will not survive a second wave and another economic lockdown. The result would be a huge increase in unemployment, poverty, price deflation, while at the same time, the central bank's liquidity pumping is creating hyperinflationary bubbles. Bailouts of some of the large systemic corporations and banks, as well as the politically explosive bail-ins, would be further desperate options for governments to implement. But they could not prevent a collapse of the global financial system. A plunge into anarchy and chaos would follow. In the meantime, a continuation of the current policy would not only lead to increased death rates as a result of the pandemic, but would do absolutely nothing to counter the hunger catastrophe of which David Beasley, the head of the World Food Programme, is warning that it will soon take the life of 300,000 people a day. Whoever would have thought that a dark age could be not ruled out for the modern times, is in for a reality shock. At last, not least, the hedonism acted out by demonstrators who confuse liberties with freedom is reminiscent of the flagellants and the descriptions of the 14th century as they are given in the writings of Boccaccio and the paintings of Bruegel. Against this background, it is to be expected that the attempt initially instigated by the British Secret Services to out President Trump from office by either a coup, impeachment, or assassination, such was the headline of the British paper Spectator on the 21st of January 2017, or a Maidan coup, as President Putin warned in 2016. These will intensify. The instrumentalization of the outrage resulting from the murder of George Floyd by violent groups financed by George Soros is part of this campaign. The reason for the relentless hostility of the neoliberal establishment in the mainstream media on both sides of the Atlantic against Trump after what for them was his unexpected election victory was and still is the intention he expressed at the beginning of his term to develop a good relationship with Russia and a good relationship with China. And of course, Trump's promise to end the endless wars of his predecessors to bring US troops home. What followed was a 3.5-year witch hunt against Trump. The war cry, Russia, 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 based on grounds for which not the least shred of evidence subsists, was followed by the attempt of an impeachment, followed by no less malicious war cry, China, China, China. Also, there is just as little substance to the charges against China as there were for Russiagate. During all that, the representatives of the neoliberal system were not ready for 1 second to consider that it was the brutal consequences of their own policies for the majority of the population worldwide that had triggered the global wave of social protest, which included the Brexit and Trump's victory, as well as the mass protests from Chile to the Yellow Vests in France. But this establishment is never interested in discovering the truth, only in controlling the political narrative, in compliance with Pompeo's principle, as he explained in his speech in Texas, quote, I was in the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. We had entire training courses for that. NATO's official narrative about Russia's alleged increasing aggressiveness, accused of redrawing the borders by force in Europe, fails to mention the broken promises made to Gorbachev that NATO should never extend its border all the way to the Russian border, and preceding color revolutions that can be described as acts of war. Finally, the coup in Kiev, which was with the open support of Victoria Nuland, which triggered the referendum in the Crimea in reaction. China's, quote, crime is not only that it has lifted 850 million people out of poverty of its own population and has become, with an economic policy based on scientific and technological progress and a population of 1.4 billion people, the second most powerful nation, economic nation, and some technological areas such as high-speed rail systems, nuclear fusion, aspects of space exploration, and G5 telecommunications, already the number one. In addition, China's offer for cooperation on the new Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative is the first real opportunity for the developing countries since the time of colonialism to overcome poverty and the underdevelopment by building infrastructure. NATO's response to China's regaining its role as a leading nation in the world, a role it played during many centuries of its 5,000-year-old history has been global expansion into the Indo-Pacific region. This is the stuff world wars can be made out of. And yet, this is exactly the direction that NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg has indicated in his outline for NATO 2030, which he just presented in a video conference with the Atlantic Council and the German Marshall Fund. And German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer took part in yet another webinar last Wednesday with Anna Wieslander, Director of the Atlantic Council for Northern Europe, who, in opening the event, quoted Lord Ismay, the first NATO General Secretary, that the purpose of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Now, AKK, that's her short name, did not even seemingly realize the insight in these remarks. The geopolitical scenario of a globalized NATO, which openly is designed to instrumentalize NATO for the purposes of the British Empire based on the Commonwealth, which would also rope the EU into playing that role, would finally position India against China, must be totally rejected by all those who are interested to maintain world peace. President Putin has just written on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, a striking article on the prehistory of the Second World War and the course of that war, and called on all nations to publish all up to now classified historical documents from that time, so that by studying the cause for the greatest catastrophe in history of mankind up to this point, the lessons will be learned to avoid an even greater catastrophe today. Putin writes in a very personal tone. He speaks of the suffering of his own family, of the immense importance of June 22nd, this day has for the Russian population, on which life seems to freeze every year on June 22nd. And why May 8th, the anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War, is the most important Russian holiday. But the indirect message is also that just as the Soviet Union defeated Hitler's Germany with a gigantic effort, the Russian people will never surrender to renewed threats. Just as Napoleon was led through a long line of defense into the inhospitable Russian winter, and his army was finally as good as wiped out, the evacuation of the people and industrial policy of an industrial capacity to the east from 1941 on allowed the Soviet Union to surpass the military production of the Nazis in only 1.5 years. But also the short-sightedness of the Versailles Dictate, the support for Hitler from members of the aristocracy and the establishment on both sides of the Atlantic, and above all, the Munich Pact, which is simply called in Russia the Munich Betrayal or Munich Conspiracy, is considered the real trigger for the Second World War. Because it was there where not only the appeasement of Hitler took place, but also the joint divvying up of the booty already took place, as well as the ice-cold geopolitical calculation that focusing Hitler Germany on the east would inevitably lead Germany and the Soviet Union to tear each other to pieces. According to Putin, what is the main message of the study of the Second World War for today? That is that the failure to take up the task of creating a collective security system that could have prevented this war was the most important piece. Putin's article ends with an urgent reminder of the summit of heads of state of the 5 permanent members of the US Security Council, which he has been proposing since January, and which should address exactly these principles on how to maintain world peace and overcome the world economic crisis. The most important aspect of that is that this format will put the United States, Russia, and China around the same table to negotiate the principles that must be the basis of the international policy if mankind is to avoid wiping itself out. And yesterday, after a long phone call between Putin and Macron, Macron said that he stands for a Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok, which opens up potentially not only the perspective of an integration of the European Union, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the establishment of a common security architecture based on common economic interests. However, if we are to meet the gigantic challenges of the pandemic, the global economic crisis, and the profound social shocks that have destroyed the trust of large parts of the population in their institutions in many countries around the world, further steps are necessary. Obviously, the cooperation between the United States and China as the 2 largest economies is absolutely indispensable. Even if this currently appears to be an unsurmountable hurdle, the extreme tense relationship between the United States and China must be replaced by cooperation on the common aims of mankind. Who, if not the governments of the strongest economies, the countries with the largest populations and the greatest military potential, should solve the problems? The Boltons must be removed from these governments and replaced by responsible people who are able to find in the cultural phases of their respective cultures the starting points for cooperation on a higher level. Benjamin Franklin's admiration for Confucian philosophy and Sun Yat-sen's orientation to the ideals of the American Republic are better advisors than Gene Sharp's How to Start a Revolution or Samuel Huntington's different scribblings. One has to define a plane on which the solutions for these quite disparate problems become visible. There is one philosopher born in the 15th century, known in Russia as Nikolai Kuzansky, Nikolaus of Cusa, who developed exactly that method of thinking, the coincidence of opposites, coincidentia oppositorum. This concept expresses the fundamental quality of human creativity, which is able time and time again to increase and at increasingly more developed levels to find solutions on a higher plane where the conflicts which have arisen on the lower levels are dissolved. This can only be the immediate implementation of a credit system that provides the global economy with credit for industrialization and thus real development of all nations on this planet. The entire life's work of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, was primarily devoted at arriving this goal. He drew up his first plan for the industrialization of Africa in 1976, the Oasis Plan for the industrialization of the Middle East in 1975. It followed the 40-year plan for India in collaboration with Indira Gandhi, Operation Juarez together with Lopez Portillo for Latin America, a 50-year development plan for the Pacific Basin, and then finally, after the collapse, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Eurasian Land Bridge as a peace plan for the 21st century. This is a blueprint for the creation of 1.5 billion jobs that are necessary today to overcome the crisis. It should begin with the establishment of a modern health system in every single country in order to combat the current and future pandemics, which will not only benefit poor countries, but also the so-called developed countries that can only avoid new waves of infections this way. Most countries have large numbers of unemployed or poorly employed youth who can be trained as medical personnel and deployed to build up such health centers. When millions of people are threatened with starvation, as the World Food Programme warns, why can farmers not double their food production and be paid parity price that guarantees their existence, including with regard to the expected increase of the world population to over 9 billion people by 2050? Can we not consider ourselves as one human single species and help to build mankind's common construction sites with the same solidarity that the entire Chinese population helped the people in Wuhan and the province of Hubei? Is it not time that we stopped wasting trillions of military build-ups, as President Trump said he would soon take up together with Putin and Xi Jinping, when we could use those resources to overcome hunger, disease, and poverty, and to develop the creative potential of the current and future generations? I think it is time for us as mankind, faced with an unprecedented disaster, to take a qualitative step of making the 21st century the first truly human century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helga. Our next speaker is Dr. Jin Zhang-Xia, who is the Executive Director for China of the International Monetary Fund located in Washington, D.C. Dr. Jin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank Schiller Institution for the invitation to attend this important conference. Also, I thank Madame Helga for her excellent keynote speech. 2020 is a very special and challenging year. The trade war, the eruption and the spread of coronavirus, the riots in the US, the world economic recession, and the escalated geopolitical tensions. I just name a few major ones. Global growth is projected by the IMF at negative 4.9% this year. So in the following discussion, some of my observations and comments are kind of sourced in research and of academic by nature. So I will speak in my personal capacity only. Global challenge should be handled globally with a multilateral approach. No country will be safe until every country is safe. When we start to discuss the multilateral approach in dealing with the pandemic and the global crisis, I recognize that there is a debate on the value of multilateralism and the multilateral institution. Some people are talking about economic decoupling, a Cold War, and even a conflict of civilizations. Since I'm from China, I ask myself, is there any fundamental conflict between civilizations in the East and West? Chinese civilization is unique in many aspects, but it's not fundamentally different from Western civilization. One example, in the 6th century BC, China had Taiji, or yin-yang concept, which is the evolution of two opposite forces. I found it surprised that this was also a core concept in physiological theory in Greek medicine in the same period of time. Another example, a core concept of Confucianism is the middle course approach that also corresponds to the doctrine of the mean that was explored extensively by Hippocrates, Plato, and Aristotle in ancient Greece. In 16th century, the brilliant Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci recognized the striking parallels in Confucius and Mencius to the Christian concept of man in the images of the god and devoted its life to building an ecumenical alliance between China and the West. During the evolution of trade tension between the United States and China, some opinions in the media have demonized China as an evil trade partner that are systematically engaged in illegal subsidizing, cheating, and stealing. That reminds me of the overwhelming public opinion in the media against the Jewish people in some parts of Europe before World War II. The truth is that after more than 40 years market-oriented reform and the opening up, China has already been transformed into a market-based economy. In fact, the share of fiscal resources in GDP mobilized by some European governments is higher than that in China due to extensive social welfare arrangement. But nobody in Europe complains that this welfare has distorted the market. China has a profound tradition of market economy, both in theory and practice. In the 6th century BC, Lao Tzu, a famous philosopher and the founder of Taoism, advised his government to rule without intervention, which is an ancient version of Invisible Hand of Adam Smith. Another famous economist and philosopher, Guanzi, in the 7th century BC, suggested that in the years of economic depression, government could increase expenditure to implement seemingly wasteful projects for the purpose of creating employment. That is the ancient Chinese version of Keynesian economics. Financially, China was also highly developed. As early as in 11th century, China introduced the first official paper currency in the world. On the issue of economic and technology decoupling, the attempt to block a major people and civilization from competing fairly with other countries and getting access to new scientific and technological knowledge is morally wrong and will help China to win sympathy around the world. On the other hand, China has the largest pool of educated labor force, including a largest pool of engineers now. That will enable the country to be more innovative, professional, practical, and rational. Compared with other multi-country free trade zones, China has already become the largest single-country retail market by itself. It is more than equivalent to a free trade zone with a highly integrated infrastructure network, centralized fiscal and monetary policy, and the deep and liquid labor and capital market. The authorities have also determined to further open its economy, greatly enhance intellectual property protection, and implement structural reforms, including introducing competitive neutrality for state-owned enterprises. In the end, it is the effectiveness and the efficiency of China's domestic resource allocation that will determine China's international competitiveness. I'm not specialized in geopolitics, but I learned that the scenario of decoupling and the new Cold War is based on an old strategy called divide and conquer, or offshore balance. It is very smart from the offshore player's perspective, but it will benefit the offshore manipulator at the expense of onshore neighbors. I wonder whether those equally smart onshore players are willing to buy this, and how high a price the offshore player wants to pay to convince so many countries to engage a long-term conflict with their major trade partner. It is not objective to exaggerate China's conflict with India at the border. It is important to recognize that the current border is largely a stable equilibrium. The common interest of these two ancient civilizations is to cooperate and develop their economies and achieve joint historical revival. The two countries should benefit from their common cultural heritage based on centuries of peaceful and friendly cultural exchanges, particularly the exchanges in the form of Buddhism. The history issue between China and Japan often looks like a deadlock, but a forward-looking approach is the key. China has largely recovered its self-confidence, and it is very clear that China's revival does not mean revenge. When new generations from China visit Japan as tourists, most of them feel they like Japan. Japan is China's only neighboring country that has maintained a lot of Chinese characters in their written language, and they use chopsticks, eat rice, use soy sauce, and practice calligraphy. All of these are the typical reflections of East Asian culture. A healthy and stable Sino-Russian relationship can be much more sustainable than many people's imagination. Their stable cooperative relationship can be attributed to many factors. It is not a coincidence that their combined territory maps the Mongolian Empire in history. Toward the end of last century, China and Russian leaders reached a wise and visionary agreement to delimit and confirm their common border. Their mutual respect and support to core interests of each other can go a long way. The biggest loss the United States could incur from a decoupling and the new Cold War is that many of the 1.4 billion Chinese people who are otherwise very friendly towards America could turn into opponents. By contrast, a friendly and cooperative China will be definitely the Americans' greatest fortune in Asia. I believe a constructive competition and cooperation between China, the United States, and other countries under a rules-based multilateral system should be the right choice. Fortunately, the IMF is still functioning normally and has played a constructive leading role, which is also supported by the World Bank and other multilateral banks. In just a few months recently, the IMF has implemented debt relief to more than 27 countries, supported by contribution from a group of better resourced members, including China. The fund has augmented its lending instruments to low-income countries by more than 10 billion SDR and approved the emergency financing of 47 billion SDR for more than 74 countries. It has created a new short-term liquidity line and is pushing for approval of new agreement of borrowing of 365 billion SDR and preparing for a new round of bilateral borrowing arrangement of 138 billion SDR. China has actively participated all the above efforts and made its own contribution. The fund and the World Bank jointly proposed a debt service suspension initiative that has been endorsed by G20. China has further called for an extension of this initiative to 2021. A fair burden sharing and full participation of all creditors is critical for a successful implementation of this initiative. China has made more efforts outside the multilateral framework, including one, additional $2 billion grant assistance to most affected countries, especially developing countries, to combat COVID-19 and recover social and economic development. Two, establish a Sino-Africa hospital cooperation program covering 13 hospitals in Africa. China has recently sent 5 emergency professional medical teams to Africa, which is in addition to the existing 46 Chinese medical teams in Africa. 3. In addition to implementing G20 debt moratorium initiative, China will provide more assistance to countries that have been most heavily affected, together with other stakeholders. 4. China has promised that once it completes developing and testing its own vaccine, it will provide this product to developing countries as global public goods. 5th, China will establish a comprehensive storage and transportation hub to support global medical supply under the direction of the United Nations. The merit of multilateral assistance is that it is rules-based, approved by a collective board representing all its member countries, and the recipient countries are facing the multilateral institution rather than a particular country or country group. Therefore, it can reduce, although not eliminate, geopolitical sensitivity. Although there are different views on many different issues and even bilateral tensions between some member countries, the majority of the fund's membership has been able to find common ground on many issues. The Bretton Woods institution could do 2 more things, in my view. First, a general allocation of SDR that will increase the supply of international reserve assets, reduce the burden of any single country to supply its reserve currency excessively, and provide low-income countries necessary resources to alleviate their debt distress. Second, the multinational development banks should greatly expand its lending to include not only developing countries, but also developed countries, including the United States itself, that will fully utilize the low interest rate environment and greatly stimulate global demand and pull up growth in receiving countries. So in conclusion, I wish the after COVID-19 world a more cooperative and peaceful one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we will hear from the Honorable Boris Meshchanov, Counselor, Mission of the Russian Federation Mission to the United Nations.
Dear and distinguished Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche, dear colleagues and friends from so many countries, our video broadcast audience. The problems put in the center of today's discussion are of high importance. We welcome highlighting acute questions of international relations through the prism of development, building physical infrastructure, cooperation between major powers in the interests of the poorest and most vulnerable. In accordance with the United Nations Agenda 2030, we fully share the crucial significance of industrialization, eradication of poverty, reforming of international credit-generating institutions, and ensuring food security. Those are basically in the spot of light for the whole global community today. We emphasize that the right of development persists as a basic human right. Development beats inequality, contribute to peace, and is indispensable condition for building just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. I would like to start my presentation citing the report by the United Nations Secretary General saying, as we are facing multidimensional and multifaceted impacts of the COVID-19, global solidarity with Africa is imperative. Ending the pandemic in Africa is essential for ending it across the world. In the context of challenging crisis, we all seek to reassess the model for development with the needs of the most vulnerable at its cornerstone. And I would like to address this issue with respect how our country deploys its relations with the African continent. It's justified that today, more than ever before, our eyes are directed to the regrettable fortunes of populations in remote corners of the world, where governments are grappling with triple crisis of health and finance, trying to avoid widening social disparity and future economic distress. Aware of its historical responsibility for the formation of the modern system of internations and its further improvement, Russian Federation considers international development assistance as an effective mechanism to solve global and regional problems and to respond to new challenges and threats. Our priorities have been the eradication of poverty and promotion of sustainable socio-economic development of partner states, influencing global processes in order to form a stable and just order based on universally recognized rules of national law and partnerships among states, as well as responding to natural and man-made disasters and other emergencies. In doing so, as it will be seen across ideals of Russian philosophers and artists, classical Russian literature, assisting our friends abroad has always been based on respect for others' dignity. It has been rooted in national policies and priorities. Technical and humanitarian assistance has always been delivered at the request of the recipient side. We have proceeded from the assumption that any changes in the spirit of colonialism, like the General Act of 1984, bringing about the principle of so-called effectuation that prejudiced the freedom of the Africans themselves, as well as attempts to come to an agreement behind one's back and that solely from the standpoint of mercenary calculation, will most likely not be accepted by these peoples themselves. On the contrary, we value and promote equitable partnership on the international arena, uphold principles of truth and justice, respect for the civilizational idea of each people, the path of development chosen by each people themselves. As the Russian President Vladimir Putin recently emphasized, the development of with the African continent and their regional organizations is one of the priorities of Russian foreign policy. Links between us are based on the friendly relations between the Russian Federation and the states and the joint struggle for decolonization and achieving the independence of African states, as on the rich experience of multifaceted and beneficial cooperation that meets the interests of our peoples. Dear and friends, one of the main lessons learned from this pandemic is an urgent need for international solidarity and cooperation without exclusions and exemptions. In line with this objective, we have committed to giving Russian-African interaction a truly systemic and integrated character. African states are confidently gaining political and economic weight, affirming themselves as one of the important pillars of the multipolar world, and are taking an increasingly active in the working out decisions of the international community on key issues of the regional and global agenda. Respect their rights to benefit equally from globalization, whatever shape it will take, for effects of the pandemic. In our strong opinion, the world needs Africa not just like a pantry of valuable minerals or a breadbasket, but strong and sovereign region, developing an equal dialogue with its partners in accordance with the norms of the national legislation, based on the multilateral nature of the world order. Today, when proposals are made to reform the global governance system, we're consistently upholding the need to reflect the role of Africa in those structures that are engaged in global governance. Our fundamentals are not only ensuring the wide global participation of African states, but also resolving conflict situations on the principle of African solution to African problems. Together, we're able to counteract political dictatorship and currency blackmail in the course of international trade and economic financial cooperation in order to put pressure on objectionable countries and unfair competition. Introduction of unilateral coercive measures not based on international law, also known as unilateral sanctions, as an example of such practices. Joint efforts are needed to promote trade and sustainable development in order to make the global economic system more socially oriented, to oppose any manifestations of a unilateral approach and discrimination, to support the world based on the World Trade Organization. Under this paradigm, the first Russian-African Summit and Economic Forum took place in 2019 in Sochi, with 9 agreements on memorandum of understanding worth of 12 billion United States dollars signed, and problems of trade, investments and banking, industry and construction, transport and logistics, energy and high tech addressed, among others. We paid special attention to identifying promising areas of economic, trade and investment partnership of the Russian Federation as a member of the Eurasian Economic Union with the African Union, as well as with the leading regional organizations of Africa, the Arab Maghreb Union, the Southern African Development Community, the Common Market for East and South Africa, the East African Economic Community of West African countries, Economic Community of Central African States, and others. In our move towards Africa, we need to be creative and promote new mechanisms for partnership, encourage active participation of business in exhibition, fair, and congress events, develop practice of exchanging business missions. Moving towards Africa in this new old world would be impossible without learning each other better, taking into consideration local customs and traditions of our partners, rich cultural and linguistic variety. In Sochi 2019, we have committed to develop cooperation in the field of education, implement vocational training, academic exchange programs to promote social stability by protecting people, especially youth, women, persons with disabilities, and expand their capabilities by increasing the availability of education, technical vocational training. Participants in the Russia Summit confirmed that obtaining quality education and developing skills by young men and women can become a driving force for economic transformation and industrialization in countries, as well as this for strengthening the industrial sector to diversify the economy. It so happened country has contributed to the development of African continent, in particular in industry, infrastructure, energy security, areas promoted by the Schiller Institute as the fundamentals of the so-called physical economy. So I would focus on them briefly. So far, Russia has been involved in the creation of the Russian industrial zone in Egypt. Among the key competences of Russia for Africa, one cannot overestimate the role of rail infrastructure for the development of Nigeria, Egypt, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola. Under current conditions, it's important that the use of technologies such as medical trains in Africa will prevent the spread of infectious diseases and fight epidemics. In energy, we count on future construction of the first nuclear power plant in Egypt, Russian Center for Nuclear Science and Technology in Rwanda, facilitating the development of integrated solutions in the field of nuclear energy in agriculture, health, education, science, and industry. Those two are not the only countries in Africa that intend to develop nuclear energy. Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Sudan, and Zambia are also on this growing list. Most African countries suffer from severe electricity shortages. Accordingly, in the future, they should double their generating capacity to meet current needs. Current pandemic cost crisis, apparently, has aggravated this challenge for them. In saying this, we should not forget about stepping up efforts to combat climate change in Africa, transfer relevant technologies, the diversity of African states. Meanwhile, general greening of the economy in our approach needs to be based on responsibility, consistency, and realism. Key to that is technological progress. Serious efforts are being deployed to improve energy efficiency in industry, agriculture, housing, and transport. In our country, we have launched National Project Environment to create incentives for Russian business to implement best green technologies to ensure the environmentally friendly, low-emission development. And we will proceed to provide assistance to developing countries, including African, to help them meet their own climate goals without prejudice to the objectives of ensuring inclusive and sustainable economic growth, industrialization of economies, and leaving no one behind. The pandemic is spreading across the world, threatening to backslide the efforts applied to build a more resilient architecture. It's high time for humanity, responsibility, and spirit of partnership to be demonstrated. A truly systemic issue with reference to today's discussion is food security, which holds a special place among Russia's priorities in its efforts to achieve a sustainable development globally. First of all, we believe that it has to be addressed at the level of supplying to the world enough high-quality food to stabilize international markets and make it more accessible and affordable for a maximum number of people. At the same time, the zero hunger goal must be addressed as a matter of urgency for those countries that are food insecure. To that end, over the last 20 years, Russia has been steadily and consistently increasing its own production and export of food, grains, cereals, pulses, meats, poultry, oils, milk, and dairy products, etc. Russia has become one of the world's largest exporters of food. During the pandemic, food supplies were transferred to the Union of Comoros and Madagascar. Apart from tackling the problem of food security, Russia donated hundreds of KAMAZ trucks, together with the necessary parts, equipment, technical support, for key World Food Programme operations in Africa. Starting from 2020, $10 million being reserved exclusively for Africa is the first time that Russia signs a geographic priority for its voluntary contribution to World Food Programme. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, East Africa is experiencing its largest invasion of desert locusts in decades, and our country is making $10 million contribution to support FAO operations in Ethiopia, Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda. In connection with the coronavirus pandemic, Russia received requests from a total of 29 African countries, as well as from the African Union, asking for assistance in combating the impacts of COVID-19. To date, units of laboratory supplies and personal protective equipment have been provided to the Democratic Republic of Congo, multi-purpose medical models, tents, and accessories to Djibouti, test systems to South Africa and Guinea. At the same time, we believe that helping sick person with a virus is paramount, but only part of the problem is solved. A fundamental factor is the availability of an effective preventive and educational system in the countries affected by the epidemic. As an example, I refer to the example of the Republic of Guinea, where have been deployed 2 mobile hospitals and where mobile laboratories based on KAMAZ vehicles were transferred. Medications were delivered. With the participation of Russian experts in this country, more than 800 specialists have passed specialized training since 2015. Russia makes a significant contribution to the scientific research of the Ebola virus. With the support of one of the flagships of Russian business, the United Rusal Company for Epidemiology and Prevention of Infectious Disease, was established in the Guinean city of Kindia. Last but not least, long and intensive discussion is undergoing concerning the unbearable debt burden of African states. Russia actively contributes to alleviating it under the Debt for Development Program intergovernmental agreements. Those between Russia and Madagascar, Mozambique, and Tanzania are being implemented. For instance, as part of these arrangements, the government of Mozambique, in cooperation with the World Food Programme, has launched a multidisciplinary national school feeding program. It provides for the conversion of a part of the country's debt to Russia, amounting to $40 million during 2017-2021, into activities that address malnutrition among children and foster primary education in Mozambique. And with that, I deeply thank you for your attention. Looking forward to your questions.
We want to thank you very much also, Mr. Minshankov, because we had some problems with the video as you were speaking. We're going to first of all make sure the entire speech is made available immediately in terms of the actual text. And we'd like to also apologize. We'd like to have at some point I just want to say this publicly. If we can actually redo your video, because it was not quite in sync. The audio was fine. People could hear it very clearly, and it was an extremely important message. And so I want to thank you again very much for what you just did. Our next speaker is Dr. Jocelyn Elders, former Surgeon General of the United States.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jocelyn Elders, and I'm happy to speak to the Schiller Institute Conference today, whose theme is, Will Humanity Prosper or Perish? I hope, as I'm sure you all do, that humanity prospers. Ironically, a lethal disease, the coronavirus pandemic, may be the only way to unify the world to reverse what might otherwise appear to be a sure slide into disaster. We're here to discuss a new paradigm for the whole world, not just for the richer or more well-off nations. Helga Zappala-Rouge has proposed that a World Health Care platform must be constructed to respond to the present crisis. She circulated a short memo to this effect, calling for a committee of opposites to be formed to implement it. I would like to respond to one passage of that memo in particular. Here is what it said. A very large number of youth in the United States and the European nations coming from the economically disadvantaged segments of society are presently looking without a perspective into the future and are therefore exposed to an entire spectrum of merits, of perils. They could be educated through a training program in the tradition of Franklin D. Roosevelt's CCC program to become medically auxiliary forces and could be deployed together with doctors and medical professions in the building of first temporary and then permanent hospitals and medical facilities in African and other developing sector nations. For the countries of the Southern Hemisphere, the support from the industrialized sections is essential. Therefore, it will be possible to find cooperating institutions such as government, religious, and social organizations, as well as youth organizations who can help us set up such facilities and win the trust in the population for such an approach. In the industrialized nations, for example, hospitals set up partnerships with existing hospitals. In the developing nations, which then could be used as affiliates for the construction of an expanded health program. One can also draw in non-governmental organizations with experience in so-called conflict areas, just such as the Peace Corps, catastrophic protective organizations, and various relief organizations. And the US and European nations, retired doctors, helpful individuals, and social and religious organizations could work in a committee to put together teams of medical personnel and apprenticeship for the deployment. Now, I think this can be done, but we must think about how we could do it. It will be very important, for example, in the countrysides of Africa, just as it is important in the cities of the United States, for people from these neighborhoods and communities to be very involved in the process. Therefore, young people from Africa should be paired with young people from America and be trained together from the beginning. We should remember that there are significant communities of African American youth that are in the United States whose parents came from Nigeria, Sudan, Ethiopia, Senegal, and many other nations. Importantly, historically Black colleges and universities could be used, as well as high school campuses in the urban centers as central coordinating points to assemble volunteers that want to participate in such a program. More broadly, various land-grant colleges, community colleges, and churches and other organizations already deeply involved in such outreach need simply to be encouraged by young people who want to assist in doing what perhaps only they can do: save the lives of their peers in Africa, the Americas, Asia, and elsewhere through demonstrations of hope and help. First, we'll need many community healthcare workers. We can take a page out of what was done in the American Civil War in 1861 in New York City with what was called the. We just take some people in the community, give them some basic health education, and develop them as medical assistants and medical technicians. Most importantly, they will be very well known in their communities. They can communicate very well with the people in their communities. You can have supervisors of these community healthcare workers who are also trained and, of course, coordinate with nurses, nurse practitioners, and doctors. But this gives you a far larger force to work with, which is what we need. We can't teach what we don't know, and we can't lead where we won't go. We have to have tiers of people who are from the community, healthcare workers who understand the community and know the community, as well as immediate supervisors to people with medical training, all the way to nurses assistants, practitioners, doctors, and others, right up to the level of super specialists. We often do too much special care and not enough public health. We not do enough of the basic public health, which would do far more to maintain the health of more than 100 surgeons. This is not an attack against specialization, but it is an assertion that we are in a condition like that of a world war, which requires something that Dr. Martin Luther King and others have often talked about: creative, nonviolent, directive action, both in the field of health. And we need volunteers, just as the American Civil Rights Movement had volunteers. This will be the backbone of this effort. In this case, we need to establish brigades and battalions of courageous young people who may even risk their lives, but in a responsible way, to save the lives of others, both here and in other countries. This is not in any way means, nor is this completely new. Many nations have tried elements of such programs, which have worked relatively successfully in the past, and members of the African Union or WHO are well aware of these measures. This, however, is a circumstance that requires the equivalent of a wartime alliance. But this is truly a wartime alliance for progress. Here we can count successes, not in the numbers of enemies killed through combat, but through the numbers of lives saved through healthcare. We will also be aided by the omnipresence of certain social media capabilities that can provide means of close coordination that would otherwise be unavailable. The fight against this virus must have a human face. There is no section of our population we can afford to ignore. For example, our already overcrowded and often abusive prisons will see an explosion of infections. Such people have been accused of theft or other nonviolent crime, or anyone else for that matter, be given a de facto death sentence, be put in harm's way solely because the rest of us have decided to forget who they are. What about the families that visit them? What about the children, or spouses, or parents attached to these people? And I believe that this can be a mobilization that replaces the image of young people as a problem or a potential source of unrest, and the image that they are the healers. Those dedicated to preserving life, not destroying it. There may be more than 2 million American young men currently held in prison for nonviolent offenses that could be more than willing to become part of this solution to help bring health both to their communities here as well as to other nations. And it could only be such an emergency as this, that this sort of bold thinking would be attached to an urgent, dire, but resolvable crisis. I pray that this moment may find us equal to this challenge, to our normal way of thinking. All the world is at stake, and all the world is in need. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Elders. We're now going to hear from Dr. Din Ifan, Deputy Director, Research Institute of World Development of the China Development Research Center of China.
Dear friends, it's a pleasure talking with you on this very important historical moment. The COVID-19 pandemic has caught the whole world by surprise. Not only have the economy been paralyzed and human life threatened, but our life habits, our life behavior have changed also. Moreover, in many countries, people have not been able to effectively curb the spread of the virus because they have no experience. Although many institutions have tried to produce vaccines, but I'm not afraid that the vaccine would be short-lived because the virus evolves so quickly. In the face of epidemic, we humans are very vulnerable. If we're not united and work together to fight with the virus, the time for the virus to spread will prolong, and the longer we will suffer. So here, I like to highlight 4 points. Firstly, when China's epidemic broke out, many countries helped China and provide China with various materials to prevention and to fight with the virus, including masks. Countries such as Japan have picked up sentences from ancient Chinese classics and write on the boxes for transferring those materials to China to show the close relationship and the cooperation between East Asia area's countries. When the epidemic situation has been brought under control in China, and the situation get intensified in Japan and South Korea. China sent a lot of materials to Japan and South Korea to help people there fight with the virus. Secondly, many such touching stories have also been staged between Chinese and American companies. Once the epidemic situation got worsened in the
I want to thank you all for tuning in, and for the rest of the conference, if you want to tune in to go over to the schillerinstitute.com, and they'll have information there regarding the entire conference. So thank you for listening in, and everyone take care and enjoy your weekend.